The chair has that devastating combination of being terrifying and charming. Firstly, let me say thank you to the MSP, to David and to Greg and to others for this opportunity to speak to you today. I'm speaking my specific job, which is I'm speaking about research I'm currently involved in, which overlaps with the concerns of the MSP, and we hope there's room for collaboration and cooperation in the future. I must apologise at the outset, because I'm going to bring to you another acronym. South Africans talk all the time in acronyms, and when you first come, it's extremely difficult to follow anything. But the one I'm going to use, which will be new to everyone, is PERSA, which is the name of this project, which stands for the Political Economy Restructuring in South Africa. It's not going to win any awards as an acronym, but it will do. So, I'm going to talk about why it was set up, who is involved, what's at the core of the analysis, and why it's of interest to people who are fighting for public services. It's obviously a great privilege to speak to an audience that's got SAMWU and NUMSA delegates present, and it's particularly useful for me because the SAMWU comrades will know Steve, and therefore they will understand my accent. The rest of you, good luck. So, PERSA, this acronym. Why was it set up? Nothing complicated. We wanted to analyse what's gone wrong since 1994 in terms of economic policy making, and to propose some alternative economic policy options. That's really what we wanted to do. We also wanted to analyse, to a certain extent, how policy has been made since 1994. And the jumping off point was the MERG report, or the report of the Macroeconomic Research Group of the ANC, which was called Making Democracy Work, a framework for macroeconomic policy in South Africa, which came out in 1993. Now, I'm fully aware that there are probably people in this room who remember the MERG report and possibly even who wrote critiques of the MERG report at the time. That's fine. That's fine. Our assumption is not that there was nothing wrong with the MERG report whatsoever. And the original editors will admit at least some of its flaws, if perhaps not all of them. But the fate of the MERG report is an indicator of how undemocratic economic policy making has been since 1994. It was commissioned by the ANC, and then it was summarily knifed, stabbed, killed and dumped by the ANC. I think it's true to say. Now there's an important point here, which is that South Africa is not alone in this. Neoliberal economic policy making is profoundly undemocratic everywhere. It concentrates power not simply within the state, but within particular ministries within the state. Within key ministers and particularly treasuries. And of course, Treasury with its connections to private finance, to reserve banks and to central banks. This is a general feature of the neoliberal period. In South Africa's case, it's been said that policy making came to be dominated by the 3 T's. That's Thabo, Tito and Trevor. And of course, it's not the Trevor and Kwani who did the introductory election, obviously. And so, partly when we look at policy making in South Africa, it's been extremely undemocratic. And there's a debate about state capacity, the capacity of the state to deliver the sorts of services that people are talking about. One part of the story is the way in which the Treasury has established itself at the centre of the South African state and has kind of enhanced its own power and sucked out the capacity of other parts of the state. Well, that's part of the story. So, who's involved? 3 of the original editors of the MERG report were involved. That's Ben Fine from SOAS, who's on the MSP steering committee. John Sender, also from SOAS. Vishnu Padayachhi from UKZN, now Rhodes. They've all been involved in different ways. The 4th original editor is a man called Lawrence Harris, who's subsequently made his peace with neoclassical economics. So we invite him to try. And be polite. Greg and David, and people at the Institute for Economic and Social Research at Rhodes, people from the Corporate Strategy and Industrial Development Research Programme at WITS, other people I could name. And since the beginning, we've had the support from Rosa Luxemburg Foundation and from NUMSA, and NUMSA have graciously given us academic freedom over the content of what we produce. So that's by way of the background. But more importantly, the meat. What's the main thrust of the analysis, and why is it of interest to people fighting for public services? Well, the thrust of the analysis is captured in the name. So we emphasise how capital in South Africa has radically restructured since 1994, but in ways which have reproduced the patterns of the past. The patterns of production and distribution and racialised inequality of the past. So it's not simply, as some people suggest, simply that there's this horrible legacy which there's been a failure to tell. 300 years of colonialism, 50 years of apartheid, nobody said it was going to be easy. So, but that's not the problem we're saying. The problem is actually that lots of the policies adopted since have reproduced the past. We're fairly broad-based, so we don't all think the same, but many of us use the framework of the minerals energy complex, which points to the domination of the South African economy historically by mining, energy and finance. And really before, so by the time of the 1980s, you're talking about an economy that's dominated by 6 very large conglomerate groupings, which brought mining and finance under their wings. Anglo-American is obviously the most famous example. Mining and finance, particularly insurance in South Africa, are huge. If people new to Cape Town, you should walk around and look at the size of the insurance companies and look at the size of the buildings in Cape Town. First time I came, I thought it was the Parliament. But that's the joke. So capital is restructured in quite radical ways. So these big conglomerates who had fingers in many pies have sold off their non-core business, and they've focused on their core operations. At the same time, they've internationalised and they've financialised their operations. So they've taken large amounts of money overseas. So they've frequently relisted their headquarters overseas. They export dividends overseas to shareholders. They export profits overseas, and so forth. So there's been a big offshoring, if you like. So again, that great symbol of South African capitalism, Anglo-American, is now actually no longer a South African corporation. It moved its primary listing to London in 1999. Obviously, this doesn't mean that these corporations are absent from South Africa. They're still extremely important parts of the South African economy, but they've internationalised and financialised their vision. That's interesting. Just to take one example to demonstrate that, if you look at platinum, Anglo platinum, South Africa dominates world platinum production. So Anglo in platinum, 40% of the world's platinum is mined just by Anglo alone. It increasingly listens to financial interests and imperatives. The demands of financial investors are increasingly felt very strongly in commodity markets. So in platinum, shareholders are demanding an average of 15% return. In the current crisis, which is much discussed in Business Day and the like, actually what you see is that platinum's shareholders are earning a 10% return. So platinum is profitable. It's just not profitable enough at present. Simply and clearly the shareholders are somewhat more important, have somewhat louder voices than those currently demanding a living wage in platinum. But it's not just mining which has internationalised its gaze. Retail, for example, ShopRite and Checkers are expanding, as people will know, across sub-Saharan Africa. Woolworths, quietly, last week, I should say, Woolworths is not connected to the European Woolworths, it's completely independent. It's very like Marks and Spencer's, if you're English. Woolworths last week bought the second largest retail firm in Australia, Davy Jones. 21.5 billion pounds brand. Makes Woolworths one of the largest department store chains in the southern hemisphere. Possibly it puts Woolworths in the top 10 in the world. I'm not sure about that, but some people have said that. So, the serious internationalisation by retail firms. Some people analyse this in terms of South African capital having a sub-imperialist strategy, particularly in the region. I suspect that their strategy is really to remove the prefix sub. That's really what I think. Finance, as the large conglomerates have unbundled, finance, if you like, has been left standing even taller, rooted in its domestic soil. So finance, which has become an even more concentrated sector since 1994, I mean, the neoliberal idea is that it's supposed to become less concentrated. Finance has become more concentrated sector. It's grown enormously. It's now 21% of GDP. So there's this huge, extremely non-developmental, powerful financial sector in South Africa, which the most important thing to say about it is it's not interested really in long-term lending to manufacturing or job-creating areas of the economy. That's not what the financial sector in South Africa does, despite South Africa having 40% unemployment. It's fueled debt-driven consumption, at the top of society, but actually increasingly further down society, as we see an enormous growth of unsecured lending to the poor. I think it's worth saying, it's just worth reminding ourselves who the financial system is dominated by the big four banks. It's worth reminding ourselves who they are. If you think One Standard, which is 20% now got 20% Chinese stake in it, it's the biggest bank in Africa by assets. It controls the Liberty Holdings Group, which includes Liberty Life Insurance, which is the third biggest insurance company in South Africa, and Stanley as well is also part of Standard Bank Group. ABSA, which is historically Afrikaans, came under the Samantha grouping historically. It's now Barclays, as it says on every cash point. As Barclays came back to South Africa. If we look at First National Bank, that's part of the First Rand Limited Financial Services conglomerate, which is dominated by Rand Merchant Bank and Redgrow, that includes Westbank, Momentum Insurance. And then Nedbank, the final one, is controlled by Old Mutual, which was previously South African Old Mutual, which again has demutualised and relisted on several stock exchanges, has extensive global holdings. There was a survey of multinational corporations which came out in 2011. And it found that there are 147 corporations which control 40% of the monetary value of all transnational corporations. That's a long sentence, but of the top 50 firms in their study, Old Mutual was placed as the 30th most powerful in the world. So, when you go to Nedbank, you're not dealing with a minor player. So, at the heart of the South African economy are these huge financial groups. So, what I'm trying to talk about then, what I'm trying to describe, convey, is extensive restructuring and financialisation of the economy. We need to underline how this has been facilitated by economic policy since 1994. We heard on Sunday about how GEAR, the free market package, was supposed to attract foreign direct investment to overcome the lack of domestic capital. Well, we know that GEAR failed to attract foreign direct investment, but what it allowed, what the liberalisation allowed, was this enormous export and offshoring of capital, a lot of it legal, a lot of it illegal. But we also need to remember that this is the trade liberalisation which went along with GEAR, hit South African manufacturing that's outside of the core of the economy. It hit it very hard as the increase in imports from overseas, foreign competition. So you've got this situation where you've got enormous capital export, growth of finance, and then the manufacturing outside the core really hit by liberalisation. What's the net result? The net result is that the South African economy is now even more dependent on the MEC core than it probably was before. That's the net result. And it seems that this is the key of understanding the heart of the triple crises and poverty, unemployment and inequality, and the inability of the economy to generate jobs for greater numbers. So, what do we need? Clearly, obviously, I can't say much, but obviously at the heart of whatever an alternative economic strategy, there's got to be policy measures to control finance, to encourage long-term investment and job creation. That's got to be at the heart of everything. And also, broad-based industrial policy. And I think we argue for quite a broad conception of industrial policy. I appreciate industrial policy doesn't tend to sound too sexy. I do get that. And I think we shouldn't see it simply as what the DTR does. Obviously, what it doesn't do is important. But that industrial policy needs to be integrated with social policy. So, for example, the struggle over a national health system or a national insurance system in South Africa. You know, we think about it in terms of its buildings, in terms of its the possibility for jobs, the possibility for skilled workers, the demand for pharmaceutical supplies, the possibilities for the state-owned pharmaceutical sector, the potentiality for jobs and services together. Seems to me to be part of how we need to understand the fight for greater public provision. And you know, there will be, I think as David quite rightly said, there will be very important battles in the near future over the NHI, which we shouldn't abstain from. They're very, very important battles. Similarly, a domestic decent house building programme should necessarily entail demand for domestic steel, for taps, for the basic necessities that we should go into a house with implications for steelworkers' jobs and construction jobs and so on. I think we also need to strengthen public institutions like the post office. And again, maybe it's not so sexy, but I think that's very, very important. So it's not simply mobile phone companies and big banks who benefit from what the World Bank likes to call financial inclusion, which is actually the incorporation of the poor into the circuits of finance. 40% of the population are outside the official financial system. So the competitive battle to include the unbanked in the financial system is quite intense. And so I think we need to argue, why should it be that Vodacom, is owned by Vodafone, which is a British multinational, which is the second biggest telecommunications company in the world. Why should they benefit from the expansion of banking systems into rural the UK today? So. Finally, I think the outcomes of the project. So, we're going to produce a series of booklets which we hope will be accessible and useful to trade unionists. So we're going to look at macroeconomic policy, social policy, finance, industry and trade, infrastructure, taxation, labour, agriculture and rural development. With informed by this analysis, and later there'll be an edited book which will probably be a bit more academic. So clearly there's a lot of relevance for people who are fighting for better public services, if only because tackling finance is key for every public service. Every public service is involved in that battle. Just very, very finally, I would say I've learned many things while I've been here, including that I ought to consider relocating to Uruguay, which was a surprise. But I think there's a sense in which when we work with the poorest in society, we talk about the poorest in society, it's very important not to forget just how wealthy a society we live in. We live in a society where the wealth to provide the public services which we're talking about is there. And it's the old struggle over the distribution of that wealth which is massive, because really without economic change, then the political transformation is also put in jeopardy.